As you know, IJPM, every spring semester, co-sponsors with the Carnegie Legal Reporting Program, directed by this man, Mr. Gorgeous, to my right, Roy Gutterman. Carnegie Legal Reporting Program and IJPM bring to campus speakers from law, politics, and media, both researchers, academics, and practitioners, to discuss a wide range of issues at the intersection of law, politics, and media. And today we are fortunate enough to have one of our own faculty, Dr. Shannon Bowen. Professor Bowen is associate professor at Newhouse School, and her research and teaching are on what some might think unlikely subject of ethics of public relations. She has published widely on this subject. Her work has been recognized by various bodies for its quality, and she is, I think it's fair to say, one of a small but growing group of professionals dedicated to advancing an ethical understanding of public relations. In this lecture series, we've heard people talk about various forms of public communications, both legal, governmental, and journalistic. And oftentimes questions of ethical constraints have been arisen. So today we will be treated to a discussion of ethics in what perhaps some people think is an unlikely area of public relations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon Bowen.
Thank you both for inviting me, and thanks to the Institute for extending the invitation, and thanks to all of you for spending your afternoon here to learn a little bit about public relations ethics, and hopefully to share your views about ethics in public relations. And before I get started, I just want to ask, has anybody got an idea of ethical decision-making models in public relations or codes of ethics? Does anyone know about one, or have you ever read one? No one? Not a single person? Okay, that means my work is needed. That's good job security for me. What I actually do is I try to help organizations make the best and most responsible decisions that they can. And in doing that, I study organizational communication, public relations, moral philosophy, corporate communication, business management, marketing, and how all of that intersects with the human communication process. So it's a pretty dynamic field. It is hard to create a lecture that can reach out to so many different levels of students and different audience members. So I hope that I don't lose anybody in some of my moral philosophy. I tend to get pretty excited when I talk about ethics in public relations, but if you have any questions, feel free to just raise your hand and ask me a question, and I'm going to plan some time at the end where we can also talk about these ideas and see if I am heading in the right direction. I certainly hope that I am. I've been doing this for a number of years. I started studying ethics in public relations in about 1996 after leaving the world of the research industry, where I really realized that we need a way to articulate what we should and should not be doing in issues management, corporate communication, and all of that research that we use to inform those practices. So that's why I started studying public relations ethics. And I apologize, I have had a little bit of a cold or bronchitis thing. I'm going to try to make it through this without coughing too much, but I can't really hear that well. So if I miss a question, I'm sure it's not on purpose. So here's what I want to introduce, just a few concepts so that we're all working from the same framework. What is ethics? How do we know what ethics is? And the very topic of meta-ethics or normative ethics, or how we know what is ethical, raises a lot of debate and discussion among philosophers, as well as among corporate communication executives that I deal with on a pretty regular basis in studying and in consulting, and even in my classrooms where I teach ethics to graduate and undergraduate students who are majoring in public relations in the Newhouse School. In general, we think of ethics as the morality of what's right and wrong. How do we know when something's right? How do we know when something's wrong? What does our society use to judge morality? How do we determine the ethics of a decision based on social and cultural norms, as well as other more rigorous decision-making methods that I will get to in just a few moments. Throughout history, it's been very interesting to me that ethics normally is connected to the idea of either intrinsic worth, something intrinsically good that we can all value as humans, no matter what our society or culture is, like knowledge, friendship, loyalty, honesty, or happiness. The idea of happiness stems from Greek ethics, and sometimes happiness is the ultimate outcome of being ethical. Other times happiness is the thing that we are to strive for and the reason why we should be ethical. And that definition comes from Immanuel Kant, who's probably my favorite philosopher. But why does this matter? Why does ethics matter in public relations or in general? It matters in the corporate world and in the communication field because we have to have relationships with our publics. Just think of your own experience in your life. How likely are you to have a long-term, continued relationship with someone you feel is unethical? Probably not a very long time, right? You're going to end that relationship and move on because you feel exploited. It's the same idea with public relations. We like to instill ethics in the organizations that we consult for or work with because we like to build long-term, trusting relationships with our publics. And that might be a foreign concept to some of you who haven't studied public relations, because you're probably thinking of the field as media relations. Media relations and public relations are not the same thing. Just to give you an example, media relations is really the idea of building relationships with the media. The news media, bloggers, etc. That's media relations. Public relations is looking at the whole ball of wax about how an organization communicates. So internal communication, such as communication with labor unions, communication with government regulatory agencies outside of the organization, and so on, elected officials, all of that is public relations. So media relations is just one small piece of the pie. And in media relations, there are some ethical problems, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But this is why. These are the publics that we normally talk to, the community, as well as consumers who you would probably think of to begin with. And when I was thinking about this lecture, I think I gave the title for it months and months ago, I added the idea of authenticity because I've been studying that in my research a lot lately. So now I'm looking at ethics and authenticity in public relations because people who I've worked with and studied over the years in corporate communication a lot of times tell me that they don't do ethics or they don't really talk about ethics, but they talk about doing the right thing. They talk about being transparent. They talk about being genuine and authentic and so on. So it really is a similar concept. It just gives you a way to be able to conceptualize it a little bit better. But just because authenticity is a buzzword doesn't mean everybody knows what it means. What does it mean? To be authentic genuinely means to be a transparent organization trying to do well. So to be rather than to seem is one of the ways that I like to explain authenticity. So authenticity means the organization conforms on the inside to being what it says it is, and it says what it really is to publics on the outside. So ethics and authenticity do go together, but there can be different faces of the same organization. There can be very large organizations that have different authentic faces in different industries and in different countries, if it's a multinational or a global pursuit, and so on. So with ethics in public relations, how do you know when you're being genuinely authentic and which authentic organizational self to put forward as the ethical one? That's where it gets to be a little bit more convoluted, and we need high-power moral philosophy to help us understand and make very rigorous analytical decisions, rather than making those seat-of-the-pants types of decisions or what I call the gut instinct decisions. A lot of times you know something is wrong, you can sort of feel it in your gut, but you can't articulate why. That's not what we do in public relations ethics, because that's a pretty low-level form of reasoning. What I try to do, and what the other scholars who study public relations ethics try to do, would be to take that feeling and put it into an analytical, rigorous framework and test the decision alternatives, the different options that you can take to resolve the dilemma, and so on, to decide which ones are truly ethical. And I'll show you a few ways of doing that in just a few slides. It's a little convoluted at first, but I promise you, it will make a difference in how you make your ethical decisions every day. So you don't have to be in public relations for it to be useful. That's the great thing about philosophy. So, how can you know or discover the different selves of an organization? Well, in public relations, we do that through research. We spend about 70 to 75% of our time in PR conducting and analyzing research. And a lot of that is statistical research, which is quantitative research. A lot of it is qualitative research. Some of it is even informal research. For instance, if I were working as a corporate communication officer, I might call up the leader of an activist group who threatens to boycott our organization or doesn't like us for whatever reason and say to that person, what are you thinking about this week? What's your organization working on right now? What are your priorities? What information do you need from me? How can I help you understand what's going on inside of our decision-making process in our organization? Would you like to come talk about it? That's informal research, and we spend a lot of time in public relations doing that as well. So, for public relations professionals, the PR process starts with research that we call formative research, and that's how we begin to know and understand what our publics think of us, what our reputation is. Whether it's unethical or ethical, we need to know that. And then we analyze that research and come up with a strategy to interact with that data that we found and find a way to change it in a way that is responsible and ethical, that's not manipulated or not spin, because that goes back to the old school 1890s days of press agentry and P.T. Barnum, and we really don't do that anymore. We've progressed far beyond that in modern public relations. That does still happen if you're talking about media relations sometimes, but again, that is a bit different of a field than the one that I'm in. I'm in corporate responsibility and ethics and communication. And if you think about it, there are a lot of places that we need those types of discussions. Everyone in here is wearing clothing, right? Okay, so the textiles that you're wearing have all been manufactured through a dye process. It can be reactive dyes, it can be pressure dyes. The chemical reactions of those dyes to make your clothes different colors have runoff products that either get distributed to a holding tank where they're treated with enzymes and broken down, but in the old school days they might have been dumped into the local river. You know, so there are a lot of reasons that organizations need someone who's considering the ethics of what they do. Because if you don't consider the ethics of what they do, they normally do what's cheapest, right, to maximize profit. So if you just look around the room, you can find a lot of examples for the need for public relations ethics. Water bottles, are they recyclable? How long do they take to break down in a landfill? Plastic cups, is that better than polystyrene, which we no longer can say styrofoam since that's a registered trademark? And so on. The wood products, the carpet, the lighting, everything in this room has a public relations component, and those consequences of doing business have ethical implications for all of the publics that they interact with. So how can you get the organization to be externally who it says it is internally? Most organizations don't go around saying that we're authentically unethical, right? But how do we know when the organization is being ethical? How you can put the best face forward of that organization in an honest way. Not in a way that's misleading or manipulative, but that's genuinely ethical and trying to be morally responsible to enhance the business that it does with society. And all of those offshoots and consequences that the organization has, whether it's textiles or water bottles or coffee or whatever it might have on the public that it deals with and society, that it can do that in a way that's the most ethical and morally responsible. So there are several factors that enhance ethics and authenticity within an organization, and this is some of the latest research that I've done. I've been building on this series of studies for a number of years, and I've been using other studies that ethics and public relations scholars have done as well to inform my research. And here are the factors that we found. You need an organizational culture inside the organization that emphasizes ethics. Because if you don't have an organizational culture that understands that ethics is important, how do you know when you have an ethical decision to make? If you don't identify a certain dilemma or issue or decision as one with a potential ethical ramification, then no one ever talks about it, no one ever thinks about it, and many unethical things can slip through the net. So you have to have an organizational culture that values ethics, that understands ethics, that rewards ethics, and that really thinks of ethics as something that it wants to enhance and spend time upon. That's hard in today's modern society because we all know how busy things are and how time-consuming it can be to conduct research and intensive analyses. And organizations oftentimes want to rush to make a decision without fully considering the ramifications of those decisions. So they need someone in the top management of the organization that we call the dominant coalition, which is normally the CEO and the C-level executives. They need someone in that dominant coalition to say, we can do this thing that we're considering, but should we do that thing? Is that thing really what we should be doing? Is that the right thing to do? We can do it, and it may be very legal, as all of the lawyers or the law students in the room will tell you, but should we do it? So that is the value of an organizational culture that spends time enhancing ethics. And by the way, if you're trying to take notes, you will be able to get a copy of this PowerPoint after the presentation, at least if you're enrolled in the class, so just so you can not feel pressed to keep up with it. The next thing is theory-wide management. And theory-wide management is just a trendy academic speak way of saying participative management, where people are empowered and engaged in the discussions and decision-making within the organization, oftentimes without regard to their rank in the organization, without regard to their official stratified level in the hierarchy of the system, and so on. So I might walk out to the assembly line and say, how's it going out here? Is there anything you think could run better about the way things happen here? And that person might have a fantastic idea that I would then create into an organizational policy. So that's theory-wide management, being participative, empowering those at all levels of the organization, especially those without codified authority, looking for ideas based on their merit wherever they originate from, even outside the organization, but inside the organization. That helps one create an ethical culture that can help discuss ethics and create really good solutions to problems that you might not be able to come up with on your own without that input from other orders. The next thing is a symmetrical worldview, which is just a worldview valuing innovation, valuing dialogue, valuing other cultures and other ideas. There's a whole line of research behind why it's called symmetrical, but I'll just distill that and say that that means it's sort of in balance, not really in balance because it's a moving equilibrium, sort of a give and take like a yin and yang symbol. So it values the ideas wherever they come from. The symmetrical worldview of an organization generally takes into account publics outside the organization rather than having the CEO or the dominant coalition who says, we're right, we know how to run this company, anybody who doesn't like it can just go somewhere else. That's the asymmetrical worldview. So the symmetrical worldview values dialogue, and that helps public relations people in their ethical decision-making process. And then, of course, you want to have a counseling role for an issues manager. That's someone like me who studied executive decision-making and public relations and identifies potential problems for the organization, tries to solve those issues before they become crises. You want to have that issues manager be a counselor to the CEO and dominant coalition so that there is someone in the room who says, wait a minute, this might look like a really good idea right now, but what about when this happens? Or if this potential consequence should come off, or the media takes a very negative view of what we're doing, and so on. So you have to have the person in the room who is not engaged in the groupthink that somehow happens at the top of organizations where they oftentimes have a myopic view and just do what's going to be financially expedient. The next thing that you can do to enhance ethics within an organization is that you can reward ethical behavior. I know that sounds like a crazy idea, but Corporations especially oftentimes don't reward ethical behavior. Oftentimes you're the naysayer or the fly in the ointment if you're the only one saying, no, we really shouldn't do that. That looks bad. But there are organizations out there, like Johnson & Johnson. They're a good example that everybody usually knows a little bit about their organizational culture and can relate to. They do reward ethical behavior. In fact, they will give you various kudos, different types of awards for your office, sometimes even bonuses at the end of the year for how you have handled, identified, and resolved ethical dilemmas. They may be a rare organization, but I like to think that others should follow their example. They spend a lot of time and money studying ethics. They hire experts. They spend a lot of time just having meetings to discuss the ethics of certain situations. You're not going to find that in all organizations, but you should. It really is something that you should encourage, because if you reward ethical behavior and you talk about it as part of your organizational culture, then nothing is hidden, nothing is a taboo topic that you're afraid to bring up, and that brings in moral autonomy, which is something very important when you're talking about conducting analysis, as we'll see in just a few minutes. Anyway, the ethical analysis part, I'm going to skip over for right now because I'm going to show you some of those actual decision-making guidelines. Let me just say that there should be a way every organization conducts an ethical analysis. They should have some agreed-upon idea of how they're going to resolve an ethical dilemma. That really does encourage ethics within the organization. And of course, you should know what the organization's philosophy is. The organization should have its own philosophy, and I'll show you some examples of mission statements in a moment where you can see that. And then, of course, here's a big one that's almost always missing: ethics training. Organizations don't spend enough time training their people on ethics because they assume that if you were a smart person and you're a good person and you haven't done anything that's criminal or negligent in some heinous way, that you're going to be a good person and make the right decision. Unfortunately, that is wrong, because it does require a lot of time and study and training on ethics in order to be able to make decisions that stand the test of time, that are morally defensible, and that are rigorous, and can be viewed from any number of perspectives, both inside and outside the organization, without being seen as capricious. That's something we certainly want to avoid. So perhaps the goal of an authentic organization then should be to strive for consistency. And that's one thing that the moral philosophers study under various terms: rationality, objectivism, and so on. But in general, I find it easier to think of it in terms of consistency. If a public knows and trusts an organization over time, then you begin to know what to expect of that organization. That means you'll feel more comfortable going to that same organization to purchase your next product or conduct your next transaction, buy your next service, because you know what to expect. And knowing what to expect builds the foundation of trust for any relationship. Of course, that's very important. But between an organization and publics, or governments and organizations, that trust is essential to having a long-term relationship. And there really is no way to do that if the publics don't know what to expect of you. If you're capricious, if your decisions seem to jump from valuing one thing to the next, and there are many examples like the Toyota case we discussed about at lunch. That's a good example of an organization that now seems quite arbitrary and capricious, and we don't know what to expect. We thought we did. We thought we expected a high-quality car that was safe. We found out later that that wasn't the case. So now people are thinking, well, I don't know what to expect from Toyota anymore. That's an example of why they need ethics to help them enhance those relationships. So what is the link between organizational effectiveness and an authentic reputation? You can say that it's building that trust through consistency, because relationships really have to depend on some familiarity. Someone knowing what to expect means that they'll probably do business with you again, as opposed to being a wild card in the market. Sometimes startup companies do have that problem because they don't have a reputation, and they have to work to establish that reputation. So, are authenticity and consistency the same? Well, not exactly. This is just to clarify what I mean when I'm using the two words. They're not quite synonyms. Because authenticity without consistency fails. You can be authentically bad. And then you might be authentically good on occasion, but you're not consistent. So people don't know what to expect. And then, of course, consistency without authenticity fails. Because you can be consistent, but if you're consistently bad, then people won't want to do business with you either. I've done some research on Enron. I've published several studies on Enron because I had a very unique level of insider access to that organization to conduct some research. And in doing so, I found that their organizational culture was authentically bad. They valued nothing other than innovating in order to create new markets. Creating new markets for them meant creating a lot of money. But this is money that was coming essentially out of nowhere through their fraudulent accounting schemes and creating new markets. Well, if you think about the saturation of electricity, how do you create new markets? You can pioneer lesser developed countries, that's true, but that really wasn't their emphasis. Their emphasis was we already have a certain amount of customers. How can we make those customers pay more by turning them into a new market? So that's how they invented wheeling, which would be taking electricity, for instance, out of the state of California, running it through Nevada, bringing it back to California and charging a higher out-of-state utility rate to those same customers in California. That's the innovative thinking at Enron, and that's one reason they collapsed. But that gives you an idea of why ethics is so important and how authenticity and consistency have to be related to being ethical. So is there still something missing? Now, if you can guess this question right, I will give you, I don't know, what can I didn't bring anything with me to give away, but I'll give you an applause. If you have a chance to do some reading, you probably know where I'm going with this. Yes, there is still something missing, because we still don't have the component that gives us the ethical, the nature of what is good. So when we talk about matching of what is done with what's said, we can do that. If we were a criminal and we were intent on swindling people, we can match what we do with what we say and be authentic and consistent in being a criminal. So we're still missing the ethical or the moral goodwill. And that should be read. It looks awfully dark, but that says good intention there in the middle. That's the missing concept. That is the absolute basis of moral philosophy, and that's where I base most of my public relations decision-making frameworks. Because, and there's a long philosophical history behind this argument that I certainly won't bore you with, but in essence, good intention is the only thing that is incorruptible. If you have any number of good virtues, they can still be corrupted if taken to extreme or excess. For instance, honesty. We can all agree that honesty is a great quality. But if I were to say, hey, you look really horrible in that color today, there's so much brutal honesty, that just probably shouldn't be said. So honesty can be too far. Courage. We would think of courage as a good one, right? We can all agree that that has moral worth and value. However, if you take courage too far, you might be foolhardy enough to think you could fly or become Evel Knievel or, just take it too far and injure yourself or others. So that can be taken too far. Devout religious belief, we've all seen how that can be taken too far into fanaticism and so on. Good intention or a moral goodwill is the only thing that philosophers have ever argued really can't be construed in a negative way. So that's the one thing we have for organizations to base their decisions upon that would be perceived as good from any quarter. Even if you disagree with the organization, even if you're suing them, you might realize they had a good intention behind what they were doing. So that does give them some ethical standing with regard to their authentic nature. If their good intention is to be authentic, to be ethical, to be a responsible organization, then they should not encounter as much resistance from their publics, from society, from government regulators, and so on. Because we always have the more egregious organizations who don't think about ethics or only consider their bottom line, their self-interest, which is called materialism, or ethical egoism, or sometimes brutal selfishness. That is the purely self-interested or financial decision-making model of doing a cost-benefit analysis and saying, well, what's good for me? What's good for the organization? What's going to advance our profit, etc. That doesn't hold up very long because organizations have to exist as part of society, and oftentimes if they ignore their responsibility to society, they become more heavily regulated. They oftentimes lose their autonomy. It's very expensive to be regulated by the government, not only in the fines that they would get from not complying, but in the actual implementing whatever compliance standards there are and making sure that someone's there to monitor those, having the right equipment updates and so on. It gets very expensive to be regulated by the government. So it's a much better idea to do it yourself, but you can hold yourself to a higher standard in most cases than what the government would require anyway. So, how do we go about getting organizations to make these types of decisions, and what's a framework that we can use? We've seen what the organizational culture would look like inside of a good organization that encourages debate and discussion of ethics, and somebody to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Let's think about it in a different way. Or, how will this look to the publics outside the organization? Keep in mind that each organization has a lot of different publics who will view things in radically different ways. How do you make sure that all of those publics are considered? That is where it gets really tough. So we have to have a core of ethics in the organization that has some form of standard and rational form of decision making that it uses. I recommend Deontology. There are really only a few paradigms of moral philosophy to choose from anyway, but Deontology is certainly the most rigorous. The others are virtue ethics and utilitarian ethics. Deontology is an offshoot of the ancient Greek philosophy, but it has been radically revisited and modernized for the last few hundred years, and Deontology is actually found in public relations practice today. I know that might be a surprise, but it is the most common form of decision-making in public relations in organizations today. So I find that refreshing, but it is a pretty complex philosophy. So let me just give you the basics. It's not that hard, really. If you think of it in terms of being rational and impartial, that is really the best way to make ethical decisions, because remember, we want to be consistent and avoid capriciousness or bias. So we need to be rational. That's sort of the overall framework behind Deontology. And then Deontology has 3 points that it really looks at as decision-making tests or decisional tests. They're often called imperatives because they are things that you're morally obligated to do if you are a rational human being, because all human beings are created equal. By virtue of their rationality, then, they're obligated to conform to these 3 decision-making tests. The first is that you want to maintain dignity and respect for all of the others involved. Now that gets very complicated when you have an organization with multiple publics around it. Some of those publics are going to be friends of the organization, some are going to be adversarial, some are going to be competitors, but those competitors might be an ally in your industry associations and for lobbying purposes and so on. So the relationships are fairly complex, but your decision for any ethical dilemma that you might be facing must meet the standard that it has to maintain the dignity and respect of all the involved publics. That's one reason we do all that research, because we want to make sure we understand those publics and know how they feel about it and that they are respected with our decisions. The second test is that it's universal. Would all other rational people decide upon the same thing? This is a hard question to answer, but one way that I say it's easier to think about the universal question, is it reversible? Would you want to be on the receiving end of the decision? Kind of like the golden rule, but this test goes much further. So could you be on the receiving end of that decision and still think it's ethically okay? If you could, then chances are it's a pretty decent option and you can move forward to the next decisional test. Universal implies more than reversibility, though. It also means, in this philosophy, that you would obligate everybody else who's also a rational decision maker to do the same thing that you're about to do. So that means if it's good for me here in Syracuse, someone in San Francisco would also say, yes, that's an ethical decision. And Quebec, and Mexico City, and Lima, and on and on. So it means that we're free of our cultural norms, and we're not bound by our position in the organization. We're not afraid of how our boss is going to react. We're not afraid of losing our job because we have the moral autonomy to make that decision based on universal norms that anyone who's rational could understand. The third test is that the decision must be based on good intention or the morally good will. Again, this is where we lose the idea of a fear of reprisal or repercussions that might go against you if you speak up in a meeting. You have to have the moral agency and what philosophers term the moral courage to say, I don't think we should do that. Or maybe that's not the most well-considered decision option. Let's see what else we can do in this situation. If your decision option passes all three of these deontological tests, then you can be certain that it's ethical. People might not agree with the decision. You may still get sued. There may still be class action lawsuits against you. There may still be advocacy groups that boycott your organization, but they can never say that your decision is capricious because it's morally defensible, it's rigorously analyzed. You've met the 3 steps of Kant's categorical imperative, which is the basis of this philosophical approach, and you can explain that decision. Rational people can agree to disagree, but you can explain the decision, and that gives you a defensible basis for making the decision. Now, I know you probably can't read this because the type is a little bit small, but this is what it looks like in a decision-making model. A lot of ethics involves decision theory, and decision theory is simply looking at probabilities and rationality and assigning numbers to certain things and coming up with decision trees and options and so on. That's one thing we do with all of that research in public relations that we spend so much time and money collecting. But when I put it into a more practical framework for corporate issues managers, it looks like this. And this one is in use at 2 corporations right now. I can't tell you their names because I'm under all sorts of contracts, but they're both household names. You would know them, and I think that they're working pretty well from what I hear. But basically, this says, do you have the moral autonomy to make the decision? That's where you start. Can you rule out greed, self-interest, bias, etc.? If yes, then proceed to making the decision. If no, you need to defer the decision to someone else or create a group consensus decision-making process, which is something that happens with a lot of public relations teams. They sit around and debate with the legal counsel and the chief marketing officer and the chief finance officer on an almost daily basis about problems and issues facing the organization. So that's where the group decision-making process comes in. These are the 3 questions that we just looked at regarding, is it a universalizable decision? Would a rational decision maker make the same decision that I'm about to make, even if they were on the receiving end of the decision? If I were on the receiving end, if my parents were on the receiving end, etc., is it still an ethically okay thing to do? That knocks out a lot of decision options, believe me. Because it's one thing for executives to say, dump the toxic waste in the river. It's another thing when they say, would you want to be drinking the toxic waste? So that one is a very helpful decision tool. Could you obligate everyone else to do the same thing, same idea? Does it maintain the dignity and respect of the publics involved all around the organization? Do they have the ear of the organization? Are they understood? Are their values taken into account in the decision? And then I added this one from a more historical framework for the corporations I'm working with. Have they faced a similar ethical decision before? And it's not just that organization, it's the industry as a whole. So this is where Toyota had a real problem, for instance, because if they had looked at a model like this and asked themselves that question, hopefully a light bulb would have went off in someone's head and they would have said, yes, wait a minute, Audi had a problem in 1987 and 88 with sudden acceleration syndrome, and it didn't work out too well for Audi because they made a statement blaming it on driver error. Maybe we shouldn't do the same thing. So not brain surgery here. If you learn from the past, hopefully you're not going to repeat those mistakes. Then the model goes on to incorporate 3 forms of the categorical imperative. This is the hardcore moral philosophy I warned you about, but really it's just the questions that I was talking about earlier. Are you acting from a duty to moral principle? And if you can answer that question, yes, with regard to all of the publics inside this triangle, yourself, your organization, society, your government, stakeholders, stockholders, internal publics, employees, labor unions, consumers, and so on, then you can proceed to the next corner. That doesn't mean you're finished. You go down to the dignity and respect corner. Are you maintaining the dignity and respect of all of those publics again? If you are, then you have an ethical decision. Now that doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. If you are an organization that does something an activist group finds morally reprehensible, you will never get to the point where they agree with you and vice versa. But the idea is, have you respected that group enough to try to understand their values and to talk to them about those values and to see if there's a way you can incorporate those values into your decision making? And if you have, chances are you can probably pass that end of the triangle. And I know it sounds like a lofty goal, but it does really happen. For instance, at Merck, they had a new glaucoma drug that they needed to test. The FDA requires that the glaucoma drug has to be tested on a certain number of bovine corneas, so cow eyeballs. Obviously, people for the ethical treatment of animals and the U.S. Humane Society and a lot of the other animal rights groups do not like that law, and they don't like the pharmaceutical companies who implement those rules and have to abide by them. But of course, they can turn around and say, well, the FDA makes us do it. So it's not really our responsibility, and they're at a dead end. They go back and forth. But instead of doing that, Merck decided they were going to meet with the activist groups, the leaders of PETA. They actually had a sit-down discussion about how this could happen with no new cows dying. So new cows dying, I mean, they're being used in meat processing plants for hamburgers and steaks and whatever else. But Merck decided they could buy the bovine corneas in 50-gallon drums, literally the cow eyeballs, for a very cheap price. I don't remember what the price was, but it was very cheap. And as long as they're refrigerated, you can test the drug on those eyeballs within 36 hours or something. Passed the FDA standard, no new cows die, so PETA was happy. So they weren't able to stop testing on animals, which is of course what PETA would want, but they were able to find some common ground where they could agree that no new cows would die so that they could get this glaucoma drug approved, which I thought was a very good win-win scenario for both of them because it saved the pharmaceutical company money and it made the animal rights group happy. And of course, the people who were depending on that glaucoma drug could then have the benefit of that new drug being approved to the market. So that's the dignity and respect end. And then, of course, intention. Am I proceeding with a morally good will? Oftentimes, that was the hardest to answer. That's where you really have to know yourself and know your organization, and you have to push the boundaries and test the organization and ask the tough questions. A lot of it does come from the organizational culture. But if you're communicating back and forth with your publics as you're doing this decision-making process and forming your organizational policies, the end result is that they should be more ethical and more enduring than if you just make them on your own. So this is how the inside of an organization sort of looks if we put all of these concepts in there and see how they would interact and how they would operate. But of course, we're missing the crucial communication of public relations. At the top there, talking with the dominant coalition and helping the organization understand what publics expect outside of it, as well as the internal publics, the views and values of the people who work there who are not at the top level of management, labor unions, and so on. And this, of course, is where we also cross that boundary of the organization as communicators. Sometimes in this case it is with the media, other times it's with government, it's with local elected officials, county officials, and so on, as well as stakeholders, stockholders, industry, people, your trade press, even your competitors. So the idea here is that if we create authenticity in the organization, We can approach it by going through the ethical decision-making process that I just described, although that is a pretty complex model. I don't expect you to remember it, but if you even have those concepts in mind, it'll help you form more rigorous decisions. But if you want to create an authentic organization, how can you do that? You can find what the organization values. And if the organization doesn't value something, you can help it understand and create what those values are by instilling a mission statement and so on. The mission statement is very important, and I'll show you a couple examples so you can see how this relates to ethics, because on the face it doesn't seem like they're very related, but believe me, they certainly are. And of course, you want to base your ethical decisions on what the organization values, matching the reality of what the organization says with what it does. The mission statement is really your first clue to who an organization is. And please take my advice. Before you ever take a job at an organization, please look up their mission statement. Please go to their website or go to their handbook or their policies manual and examine what that organization values, because that'll give you a good idea of how you will be valued within that organization, or how you might be unvalued in that organization if you don't fit within the organizational culture. So the mission statement shouldn't be an esoteric or lengthy document. It should be something that is clearly stating what the organization's values would be. So here's an example from a company called Cognex. Their mission statement's to be the standard around the world for excellence in machine laser vision and to exceed the expectations of our customers, employees, shareholders, and neighbors. So this is a good mission statement because it gives you a guide to the ethical priorities of this company. They want to exceed the expectations. That means if you have a problem with their machinery, they will exceed your expectations on fixing it, on customer service, on training, etc. And if they don't do that, they're failing to achieve their mission. It also specifies who their key publics are. Number one is customers. That's going to be their first priority anytime they have an ethical dilemma. Will this exceed the expectations of our customers? What will our customers think of what we're about to do? If we give the golden parachute to the outgoing CEO, for instance, what will our customers think? They are our first priority. Second priority, employees. Third priority, shareholders. And then neighbors is a general term for community publics, governmental publics, and so on. So that gives you a good idea of what a general mission statement would look like. And I just pulled that one down from the web. I don't know the company or anything. It's just a good example. They're easy to find. Now, here's the example from Enron, the world's leading energy company, creating innovative solutions. So I've already told you what their innovative solution was to how to get more money out of California, for instance. But they were being true to their mission statement. If we had looked at Enron's mission statement, and I've done an extensive study on their mission statement and code of ethics, you can see that there is nothing in that organizational culture that values ethics. Their actual code of ethics document is a 65-page book that does not have ethics in it. It's a compliance document. It says things like don't disclose trade secrets, don't steal office equipment, those types of things. Not very helpful. So what are the core values of an organization, and how do those core values tell us how to create ethics and what's valued in the organization? From a public relations perspective, we want the core values of the organization to match up with us as public relations counselors. Now, that being said, there are some pretty negative and nasty press agents out there and people who call themselves experts in crisis management and even opposition research. That's my favorite term for digging through trash cans and hiring private investigators to follow people. That type of thing does happen, but it shouldn't happen, and that's really not a part of what I do. That's a part of the old school public relations that used to be before about the 1950s. That was a very prevalent model. Since that time, corporations have tried to be more socially and morally responsible, and that means they needed somebody to help them do that. And public relations people stepped into that role, thank goodness. And a lot of times in my research, people tell me if I don't do it, nobody else does. We can count on the finance people to talk about what's financially expeditious. We can count on the legal folks to tell us how to stay out of court, but nobody says what we should or should not be doing or really thinks about it in any more detail. So, core values can be any number of things in an organization. It can be innovation, if it's in a good, responsible way, of course. It can be ingenuity. It can be integrity. It can be any number of the things that we might consider good. But keep in mind, it has to have the morally goodwill behind it. And here's just some examples from the same company. I have the good mission statement. They do specify their core values, and I recommend that every company should have an ethics statement and a core values statement that really identifies what they consider their top priorities. That way, when you confront an ethical dilemma, you're already going to have a roadmap of how to solve it. You're going to know what's considered important, and that gives you the landmarks to look for when you're determining what's the right course of action ethically. So, for Cognex, it's customers first, excellence, perseverance, creativity, integrity. So we can hope and assume that all of those things are valued and rewarded in that organizational culture. So here are some key recommendations. Use your organization's values in discussing ethical dilemmas and advise senior management on those values. I know that sounds kind of simple, but from my research, what I have found is that a lot of times issues managers will say to me with all seriousness, we don't ever talk about ethics here because we're such an ethical company, we don't need to discuss it. And that's pretty scary when you consider the types of decisions that can be made if you're not examining them rigorously and thoroughly. One issues manager at a very large worldwide corporation said to me, I'm a big boy, I don't need anybody to help me with ethics. So those types of decisions, you know, they come across your desk, and if you don't label them an ethics decision that's worthy of analysis, they go by unchecked. It's seat-of-the-pants decision-making, it's gut instinct, which is very, very dangerous, because we've seen from any number of cases like Enron or Toyota that those types of decisions are often wrong because they're not rigorously analyzed. So I recommend that organizations write out their values and that they spend time talking about ethics. They spend time discussing what they want to foster with their policy. And with their policies and decisions, they can foster things that hopefully an ethicist would find good. You can create a mission statement, you can create core values, and public relations then can communicate ethically and openly and honestly and create that authenticity and transparency that we hope organizations would have as productive members of society. So, how would an organization resolve the dilemma? Try to envision thinking of some ethical dilemma that you faced and think about how a good organization might resolve it. What would they consider important? Would it be respect? Would it be integrity, honesty, innovation, creativity, duty? What are some of the things that come to mind? Can you think of any terms that we haven't thrown out yet that they might consider good? Profitable, of course, because you can't stay in business if you're not profitable. But is there such thing as too much? Yes, of course. Only good intention is the thing that's incorruptible. So the idea is start to think of organizations in terms of what can you identify about them that is an ethical value or a core responsibility. So step by step, just to quickly run through this because I want to allow some time for questions. Do research on the ethical issue. That's the first step always. Once you've identified that there could be an ethical problem, start doing as much research as you possibly can. Informal research, formal research, quantitative, qualitative, the more research the better. Advise management on how the issue could impact your organization and ultimately impact your bottom line. Advise according to what the organization values. It's no good if I just stand here and say, well, I think that it's best to do X, Y, and Z because I really value that. You have to go by what the organization values and rewards and what they want to enhance and what they think will ultimately make them a more effective organization in the long run. And then what value would be upheld with each option you're considering. By the time you've done all this research, you've probably formulated 3 or 4 decision options, option A, B, C, and D, of various ways you could resolve the dilemma. Which one upholds all of the points of that triangle that we were talking about with duty, dignity, and respect, and good intention? And then ask, what do your publics expect of you? In public relations, we're always concerned with what our publics want and need and expect from us, what their informational needs are, but more along the lines of what do they need to form a long-term relationship with us where they're going to value that relationship over the coming years and keep returning to that relationship because they trust us, because we have valued and respected their views. You have a responsibility to communicate ethically, of course, in the interest of truth, and that breeds other priorities as well. You have a responsibility as an ethical public relations practitioner communicating honestly with your management, but also with the media, with your legal counsel, who I know a lot of you in here have a very different perspective than the public relations counsel would. The legal folks oftentimes don't want to say anything because it can come out in a case later. The public relations people always want to say something. So you have to find the happy medium of trying to make a statement of some kind that will help your publics understand what you're doing, but the legal counsel says, yes, that's okay. We can certainly say that, and that's not going to get us in too much hot water, usually. So those priorities lead to an ethical reputation. If you conduct your issues management and public relations like this over the long term, trying to prevent problems, trying to solve the problems before they become crises, that is the best way that you can help your organization become ethical. And consistency internally leads to consistency with your external publics, meaning that they know what to expect of you, but that you can also rely on those external publics when the organization needs help. Grassroots lobbying, for instance, a lot of times organizations will call up on those who have used their products or services or who have worked with the organization and so forth, and ask them to speak out to their elected officials on behalf of that organization or industry. So that's a very common reputational reservoir is what we call that. If you have a good relationship with those publics over the long term, eventually the organization can come to depend on them as well. And we all think of it in terms of people buying stock, but really there's a lot of other ways that we can leverage that type of interest in the organization and support for it. Letters to the editor, for instance, feature stories on retirees from the organization, and so on. So that helps enhance the organization's reputation for genuineness and authenticity. So the rationale here, I've pretty much said all of these things, but it's for building trust with key publics, allowing the organization to be known from the outside. It's very hard to know what's going on inside of a corporate headquarters, why their policy is certain things, why they're testing drugs on animals or children, for instance. The FDA does require pharmaceutical companies to test drugs on children, for instance, if the drug is indicated for children. But how can children give informed consent? A lot of the pharmaceutical companies have a huge ethical issue with that the government requires them to do it, and so on. So those are the types of decisions that you might encounter. It makes your analysis rational and defensible. It allows you to meet expectations, build good relationships, and build commitment and motivation among both those inside the organization and those outside the organization. So I'll skip over the Enron case since we've already beaten up on Enron enough for one day. Well, maybe not quite enough, but pure advocacy is out. That's really the old school model of public relations. It doesn't exist very much anymore in the corporate world. It does exist in the agency world, but I think those people have a much harder time justifying their ethics than those who take a more rational approach, advising management as counselors rather than just being an advocate. Because you can hire anybody to be an advocate. That doesn't mean that you're doing the right thing. And they do need someone to say sometimes, are we resolving this situation to the best of our ability? Is this really the best way to do it? Just because the CEO likes it that day doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And someone needs to do a rigorous analysis of what is the right thing to do. So organizations who fail to be authentic really take a big risk. And that was my main point with discussing Enron, if you're not being authentic, if you're not being ethical and consistent and transparent, you're running the risk of not existing anymore. So if you hire a public relations agency who does pure advocacy and will advocate for pretty much anything you want as vociferously as they can, you're taking an enormous risk. Because what if it backfires? What if the government then decides that you need to be regulated, or your industry needs to be changed, or you're no longer allowed to purchase advertising, or any number of the things that have happened in the past? What if that happens? What if you go out of business? What if you go bankrupt as a result? What if the unethical practices that you're doing and advocating force the sale of your company, like A.H. Robbins, for instance, or McDonnell Douglas? There's so many cases that I don't understand why people are still engaging in pure advocacy rather than a more counseled type of model. The pure advocacy model of public relations really has gone the way of typewriters, I think. And it's continuing to become a more common function to find issues managers counseling their senior management. My research found in a worldwide study I had 11,000 people who could have participated. Out of that pool, 1,827 did participate in the study, so very large sample size with high confidence interval. 65% of those folks counseled their senior management on what they should or should not be doing regarding ethics. And that's worldwide for public relations practitioners. So that's a lot of people saying that, yes, I am the one who says we can't do this or we shouldn't do it. Sometimes they describe it as being the fly in the ointment, or being the one person to stick their finger in the dam or say no when everybody else has decided on a certain course of action. But I think it's very important for public relations to take that role, because if they don't, who will? Okay, so I would love to entertain your questions. Yes, sir.
In those multiple levels of people, customers, stockholders, don't you have to include suppliers also?
Absolutely. And suppliers and distributors are one of those groups who are both inside and outside the organization sometimes. So that relationship is a little bit special. And it's the type of relationship where I think if you don't pay attention to maintaining a good relationship there, your costs will go up. One way or another, your costs will go up. So I think it's a really good idea to consider them as one of your key semi-internal publics. Some people think they're internal, some people think they're external, and it really depends on the industry, but absolutely.
They're a component of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether they're, you have to satisfy a lot of elements. Customers being first, stockholders, there's some humor that goes with that. Secondly is, how does a company of national origin, Toyota, not the stockholders, but the stock, there's got to be a stockholder that, or a couple that didn't say anything. How do those people live with themselves?
I try to figure that out every day. I don't know. I think that the stockholders probably didn't have access to the knowledge of what was going on with the cars. There may have been rumors, but I think they probably didn't realize the extent of the problems.
Doesn't the stockholder or the board of directors have an obligation ethically to know that, to be advised of that?
Absolutely.
To ask about that?
Exactly. That's part of that organizational culture where you should be able to discuss ethics. You shouldn't be afraid to bring it up. It's part of the theory Y culture where anybody can say anything without fear of repercussion. How realistic is that in the real world? Yeah, it doesn't really happen that much.
Well,
I wish it did.
but what if a board of directors or a trustee
Right.
ever said, what is going on here that's going to step on my butt? And I got to know that. I don't want to know about it after it's happened. What is wrong with asking that kind of a question?
Absolutely nothing, and they should be. But I think that the tension oftentimes results between the CEO trying to keep his or her job while looking good in front of the board of directors and having the legal department help in covering up anything that may be suspicious. settling things quietly, so that the board of directors doesn't find out. Now, I'm not saying that is the case at Toyota, but it certainly looks like it from the outside.
Actually, I could just get a
Yeah.
little bit of time, so I'll allow one more question.
I know that this is made primarily for like corporations and PR, but how do you think this relates in terms of like the legal system and or like judges using this kind of model themselves?
It's really interesting, and I did a whole presentation on that last year for the McKinsey Hughes case competition, and essentially I put judges and other governmental publics, legislative or elected, inside of the triangle just like any other public. So they are one of the considerations, they are not the only consideration. They can't be the only consideration because you would never have civil dissent of any kind. If they were the only consideration, you can't just base things on what's legal, because if you did, well, ethics has to sort of go apart from what's legal. And sometimes they do run counter to one another, such as civil rights, slavery, things like that. We have different ethical standards than we do legal standards, and I think it's important to recognize that. But I think it's also important to remember that judges and the legislative branch are publics, and they should be communicated with and understood and valued as publics to the extent that it's legal and possible. Does that make sense?
I'm afraid we're actually out of time. So we always have a reception at the end of these lectures. So I encourage everybody to stay, have refreshments, and continue this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.